Yeah, it's up.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's a good way to kick us off, is that, you know, the coronavirus really is a symptom of where we're at in terms of, you know, the climate crisis and the ecological crisis kind of reaching a tipping point, and the sort of impacts on biodiversity and Indigenous and Black and Brown folks predominantly. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of say that throughout this, we're going to talk about, you know, not just the devastation to the landscapes, but the devastation to those relationships with those landscapes. And that's why I think addressing whiteness, addressing patriarchy and colonialism and those relationships with nature are at the core of addressing the climate crisis. And sometimes there can be this fixation on parts per million, on carbon counts, and on climate talks that are happening. But the coronavirus has really, I think, brought us back to what a lot of Indigenous practice is really about when it comes to the climate crisis. And that is really about listening. And as Sahel mentioned, so much of my practice has been about being an activist, and I wouldn't actually even consider myself that. I actually trained as a philosopher, and then I was training as a herbal medicine practitioner and a traditional herbalist. And as I was doing that work, the more and more I did ceremony and more I sat on the land, the more I started to realize that there was something wrong with the land, and to begin to open up. And I'm also a Gemini, so that's why I have to move between modalities and praxis. And my father's a polymath, he's an engineer and a poet. And so for me, being interdisciplinary and addressing the climate crisis with those modalities all intact and with equal value, I find is a way of also decolonizing how we respond to the climate crisis. And so as one of the few women of color who have been a director of an organization and working in the environmental sector, very quickly my activism had this secondary praxis alongside it, which meant that I also had to consistently fight for the space to be there, to be heard, and to bring those practices into it. So this is actually a sculpture that I made. It's actually a megaphone. And what I did was I reversed the engineering in the megaphone so that you can actually hear through it. And that was a way of expressing the fact that before we get on our megaphone, before we start speaking, there's so much consultation and process that happens. I'm not Indigenous. I'm a British Canadian Sikh woman, presenting woman. And so I'm not Indigenous, I don't speak for Indigenous people, and I also have a certain amount of privilege having a British and a Canadian passport. So I also sit between that relationship to the Crown, to the British Crown in the UK and in Canada, and also in relationship to Indigenous peoples. So much of my practice has involved listening, whether that's been listening to the plants and to the medicines in that training, or listening to the frontline communities about what they were witnessing on the land. Oh, sorry, I just came up. I was supposed to just stay in presentation. There we go. So this is what we're talking about. This is the boreal forest. And as I mentioned to you, I'm Canadian as well as being British. And when I lived in Canada, I didn't actually ever hear about the extraction that was happening in the tar sands. And so we often hear about what is happening in the Amazon. The Amazon is being deforested. However, the same thing is happening in the boreal forest. It's the second largest rate of deforestation on the planet. And so it's now it's essentially a site of what we would call ecocide, and I would encourage you to look up the work of Polly Higgins, the late Polly Higgins, who was actually working for there to be an additional crime of ecocide, which would be sit in the same court of justice as genocide, but this would be crimes against the planet. So the ecocide would mean that this territory cannot be rehabilitated in real time. So it will take generations for this to heal, and it will not return to its I'm not sure what's going on with Zoom. Are we okay?
Looks okay to me.
Okay, I was going update messages. So it won't be able to be rehabilitated. So that's really important when we're talking about climate change and devastation to territories on this scale. Often the companies will say that it can be reclaimed and it can be restored. And that's really important from an ecological perspective, but also when we're thinking about this landscape and the relationship to the landscape. Industry calls the forests, the trees, the squirrels, all of that life overburden, and that they have to remove the overburden and strip the overburden to get to a sticky black substance that's in the soil, bitumen. And the bitumen is then refined to oil before it can even be processed. So for each barrel of oil, it takes 3 to 5 barrels of water. It takes highly corrosive solvents and also natural gas. So this is the energy logic that is operating in Canada at the moment. And that's another important point. This is Canada, and Canada often promotes itself as, you know, liberal, queer, you can smoke weed, all of that stuff. However, the reality of Canada is that it continues to exert a slow industrial genocide on its people. It is a laggard in terms of standing up for international climate codes, and most Indigenous communities still don't have access to clean running water. So even though trillions of dollars worth of resources are being extracted from their land, they don't have access to that resource as well. So that's also the economic paradigm which is peddled, which is that this is for the economy. But this oil doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make any energy sense. And so you may sometimes hear about the Keystone XL pipeline or the Standing Rock pipeline, but actually this is where the oil is coming from. So as I said, you know, when we're talking about the climate crisis, we have to think about the devastation that has already happened. And that is why Ecocide is a really important framing tool, because we think about the devastation that has happened to the land. And with that is the devastation to not only the biosystems, but also the relationships with those territories. So Indigenous peoples actually sit on 80% of the global biodiversity that we need to protect to have a chance of averting the climate crisis. The UN acknowledges this. However, within the Paris Climate Agreement, you'll find that there aren't any Indigenous rights and there aren't any human rights. So it's really important when we think about what are the strategies on the table, what is this pathway that we're going down. So this is what it looks like at the end. And the area that they're slating up to devastate like this is the size of England of Wales. Just for you to get a sense of the scale, it's the largest conglomeration of corporate power in history and the largest industrial project in the history of the earth as well. So, you know, when we're talking about whiteness in relationship to the land, when I walked through this, I've walked through this place a few times, and the smell of it is absolutely noxious. Like you can't breathe, you instantly get a rash. There are cannons that fire off every 30 seconds, and that's to scare off the birds and the other animals from landing on there. So it's literally a war on the land. And I think I remember the first thing thinking was just like, who are we? Who are we that this is the land that we've left it in? Never mind the devastation that is there and the workers there. Who are we as human beings in this time? So I think that's really important as well, that when we're thinking about the devastation of territories, of ecocide, we're thinking about the way that we see the land and the way that it can be, its relationships be destroyed in order for that to happen. So when we're talking about activism, again, you know, this theme's coming up about what do we think is activism and what is considered that. And I think in the last few years, we've had this rebranding, you know, with the popularity of Greta and the brand XR. of thinking that it's all placards and this kind of 90s aesthetic. But when we pull ourselves back into this fact that this is a 500-year journey of resisting ecocide, of resisting patricide and colonialism, we have to understand that there are multiple forms and modalities in responding to that. So this was a healing walk that we did. The community had had many protests, many international situations, and they wanted to have a healing walk. And so we walked through the land and we sang for the land. And a really important part of that is bearing witness to what has happened to the four-leggeds, and to take responsibility as two-leggeds for what that means. And I'm just going to go back. So what we did briefly at the beginning, we saw the website for No Tar Sands. So I tried to raise this issue at many large NGOs, and most notably Survival International, and I was told that it was too late for those Indigenous people. They weren't the loincloth, guardian, centerfold Indigenous people that they were used to represented. So I was told to stop working on this, that it was never going to be stopped. The project was too big. So being a Gemini and being one of 4 children, I took that as a cue to start my own organization. And I met with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And what we did was we started to research the pipelines of money and corporate power and government that was involved in this project. And that's a really important point, is that Black and Brown and Indigenous people aren't just on the front lines of the impacts of these fights, we're also on the front lines of the strategies. So, you know, that meant looking at what are the banks, the corporations that are invested in this, and also the treaty rights. So many of the treaties that Canada is violating were signed with the British Crown. So that means that we have an accountability and a responsibility to act in the UK. So we designed this logo with the chief of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. And all of the design and all of the communications were done in consultation with the communities, which is something that rarely happens at large NGOs. There's a huge infrastructure, communities rarely get sign off, but from the get-go, that was something we did. And at the beginning, this center drop in the middle of the maple leaf was actually black. And then the chief said, no, that has to be red. This is our blood. This is blood oil. And so when we did these first actions outside of BP and Shell in 2009, they went international in the media. And so we realized then that we had a responsibility to pay attention to this and to expose what was going on there. And so this is, so for the last decade, what we did was we exposed this web of money and connection. And you know, a lot of these actions look like what you see replicated by XR, but this was started by people of color, by grassroots movements. And the difference is that when we were pushing banks, such as the Royal Bank of Scotland, who at that time were actually 84% owned by the government, we were pushing them to remove their investments from British Petroleum, from tar sands and coal projects. But the difference was that we weren't just doing it from a climate perspective, we were also saying that any projects that do not have the consent of communities, that violate Indigenous rights, also shouldn't be invested in. So that's something really important as we move forward with the climate movement, that we're not just asking for individual projects to be stopped because another financier will come in. You have to be shifting the financial systems themselves. So for me, when people ask me what my mediums are that I work in, I'm like, well, I work with markets. So we work with invisible forces. We have to change the way they operate, and that's really sort of coming from the spirit of voice as well, that we are all activists, we are all we're all artists, he said. Well, I'm saying we're all activists in the sense that we are all shaping the economy, and so over 10 years we actually shifted the financial landscape, where now tar sands are considered a risky investment because of the climate impacts, because of the reputational risk that came with doing these actions every year, and that brand damage that came along. And at the bottom, the image there is the British Petroleum annual general meeting. So as well as the tar sands, other frontline environmental justice movements started reaching out to us when this was after the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. And so again, you know, this action looks like any XR action that you'll see now. However, again, what was core to it was the consultation. You know, setting up a Skype with the frontline communities and saying, what is happening for you? What do you want the story to be? And also, what are the concrete asks that you have of British Petroleum that we need to be putting forward? So that's complicating it a bit. We're not just like, oh, shut BP down. There are often specific asks. So for instance, in this case, the Fisher people were asking for compensation. They were asking for research into the Corexit, the chemicals that were being used. So that's something really important. Again, going back to that image of the megaphone, you know, before you get on the megaphone, having a conversation and building those relationships. Just gonna grab a drink. So as well as pushing on corporations and banks, besides the COP and the Paris talks, there are, you know, there's numerous climate legislations that are passing through the EU Parliament specifically. And so one of those EU legislations that was moving through was the Fuel Quality Directive. And so the European government started to hear us and started to realize how polluting this oil was, that the EU Parliament could not meet its targets if it was to bring this oil into Europe. And so we tried to expose how basically the Canadian and the British government, they're so awful, they're so in cahoots. So that, you know, that sovereign crown relationship still exists with the UK and Canada in terms of undermining climate legislation. But, you know, these legislations, they're really boring and they're really intricate. These EU parliamentary processes are very shadowed. And so what our job to do was to expose the revolving door between the government, but also to bring some kind of a narrative to it and to bring it to different audiences. So this was a meeting that was happening at Canada House in London. And I worked with felt artist Lucy Sparrow. She's an amazing felt artist. She makes like whole sex shops and whole supermarkets out of felt. And this was her idea that we work together to bring the felt impacts of the tar sands to the doorsteps where these meetings were happening. So, you know, bringing some sensitivity, bringing some difference to it. Also, just because I was getting bored, like how many times can you stand outside Canada House with a banner? How do you keep yourself motivated and enlivened? You know, we talk about burnout sometimes, and sometimes it's because we're doing the same actions and the same collaborations. And also it was about creating entry points. You know, a lot of the people in my life at that time and in my life are queer women of color who are immigrants, and they couldn't necessarily go to these actions and risk getting arrested, but they wanted to be part of it. They were part of my life. They were part of this work. So having sessions at home where we were sewing, where we were creating the visuals and designing it so that people have a way to be involved, to have connection with it. And also, you know, filling out all of the roles that are a part of that, you know, like making the soups that everyone can sew, like bringing all of those parts to that culture of organizing is really important. Another part of the work that we've been doing has been around, you know, I think some of you might have heard of the Liberate Tate and the Art Not Oil Coalition. And so I was a part of that coalition, but again, there's this thing that happens of this erasure, basically, of women of color activists from that space. So I found this photo. I was digging through archives of trying to be like, well, where was I in that history and how do we get erased? So I actually do a lot of archivism work where I try and find images of myself and I write myself back into movement her story. And I think that's really important, especially at this time where we see XR and we see Greta, and there's this feeling that activism just got invented, but we have been part of those stories. And it's really important because when we're asking to remove BP and Shell from the Tate and that complicity that they have with oil companies, when we're envisioning the future of the galleries, we need to be part of that conversation as well, because who are we trying to liberate Tate for? And then this is just another part of this work, you know, often, again, that idea that if you're an activist, that you're in a certain cultural sphere, but most of the culture that I consume is that I'll be watching Kardashians, I'll be reading Grazia and pop music. So I was constantly looking for ways to bring pop culture into the work that we did. So this was actually a hat collection that we commissioned for Kate Middleton when she was going to Alberta. I wore that hat to a lot of Halloween parties. It was very fun. And so again, this was before Instagram. So we took out banner ads in Grazia. We had a fashion show with them. So, really thinking about how do you bring these messages to a different audience as well. Yeah, so I kind of want to come back to, again, this question of, as well as the campaigning and the corporate campaigning that we do and putting pressures on banks, I ended up having this other role where I had to understand, to challenge the whiteness of the environmental movement. And so for me, I was really humbled that I got to work around the anniversary of the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9. They are Nigerian activists who resisted Shell from their territories, and they were eventually executed by the Nigerian government in collaboration with Shell. And Ken was actually a playwright and a poet, and he wrote like the equivalent of EastEnders in Nigeria. And so within that, he would weave these stories about immigration, about oil, and he really became like a beacon of light for me in terms of understanding that the way that we deliver our messages, this culture of activism, is really, really important. It's not, they have to be interconnected. And especially when you're working with Indigenous rights, because with the Indigenous rights are the key to the land rights. So we have to constantly see how they interweave and to connect to each other. And for the 20th anniversary, this was a collaboration with British-Nigerian sculptor Sakari Douglas Camp, and she made this incredible van that had the name of the Ogoni 9. It says that I accuse the oil companies of genocide, and inside it was a cinema and a library all about Ken and the Ogoni 9, and this traveled around the country in the UK. And then for the anniversary, the Nigerian people asked for it to be sent home. So my job was to get this on a ship and to send it back to Nigeria, to Port Harcourt. It actually never made it. First it fell in the sea, and we had to get it out and get scuba divers to clean it up. And then when it did get to Nigeria, it was taken away by the colonel who's under Buhari at the time, who was actually responsible for the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa. So they seized this bust, they seized this sculpture, it never made it back. But what we did was we used its absence as a negotiating tool to get meetings with the Nigerian government to try and negotiate the cleanup of Shell in the region. But it really became, this bus, and to do this impossible thing to try and to keep that memory alive. And we were really lucky that this designer, John Daniel, who's now passed, sadly, he created all these beautiful graphics for us about the bus, and they ended up trending on Nigerian hip-hop radio stations, which was really super cool. And you never know where your campaign is going to go. That would be definitely something. Always use the absence, use the thefts and spin them and work with them. But it really got this message of the bus to a whole new generation and kept that memory alive. Just going to do a time check. How long have I got left?
How long do you need?
Just like 7 minutes.
10 is fine. Keep going.
Okay, great. So this is the, so as I mentioned, so a lot of the work we've been doing has been to really go to that interface where these corporations are making decisions. And I think I would really encourage you, once coronavirus is over, to find ways to go to these shareholder meetings, to go to these decision makers. I went to the Shell AGM. You just purchase a share, or if somebody has a share, we just bought. They gave us a proxy, and we went into their meetings. And this was when there was a spill in the Gulf of Mexico, a Shell spill. And this is my dear friend, Monique Verodin. She's a filmmaker. She has a great film called My Louisiana Love about Hurricane Katrina and the impacts there. And so what we did was often, and this is a point about the nonprofit industrial complex, that the resources are not with the communities. They are not with the frontline people. That is another way that whiteness and white supremacy manifests. I actually don't have any money to run UK Tar Sands Network. I have to freelance, and that's quite common within the sector, especially for queer women of color. So we have to be constantly innovative and creative. And so we got these pop-up photo exhibitions. We took them outside of the meeting. This is Shell's meeting where they decide their budgets. And we went inside and tried to bring awareness to the shareholders, to the financial press, that, you know, that a spill had happened, that communities were being impacted by this. And it was a really powerful moment because we also had elders there from the Arctic. And I remember the elder from the Arctic going up to the CEO of Shell and being like, you're going to drill in the Arctic. Can you guarantee food security for generations unforeseen? And he just had no answer. And so this meeting of paradigms, this confronting of power is really, really important when we realize that, you know, these corporations can seem faceless and they can seem completely, you know, all powerful. But when you come down to it and you realize that this is a difference of opinion in terms of value of life, value of land, and accountability. And so I just want to sort of bring us to this as well. So the UK Tar Sands Network, we work really closely with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And as I mentioned, whiteness within the environmental movement, which to be honest has got worse in the last few years with the onset of Greta and XR. There's been a real erasure of those movements. So we've had to work more so to really get our messages across. So digital media is a really important part of that. During the COP, we had our channels where we produce media, but we're not always producing it just for white audiences. The message is also to communicate back home to Indigenous communities, to frontline communities, education about the issues, about the strategies, to connect struggles with other struggles. And our channels were reaching over 1 million viewers during the COP. And that was because we were decentering whiteness. The media that we often make is for us and by us. And that's just another sort of image of, you know, literally just before the COP in Paris, we were supposed to lead the march. And we literally had the NGOs set the police on us and remove us from the front of this march. So we're constantly having to deal with the struggle within the struggle. And so, you know, sadly, so much of my energy and creativity has been to have to comment on this because, you know, it has huge manifestations for the strategies that we employ, the relationship with policing, in protesting, even the cultural ways that activism is presented. So we have to think about this culture of activism so we can plan for the future. You know, we're going to be having to resist the climate crisis for the next, you know, probably the rest of our lives. So we have to ask some questions about what that's going to look like, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to resource that labor as well. So yeah, just to wrap up. So, you know, this is just some of the research that I've been doing. I hold dialogue spaces around power and privilege to try and, you know, not just make all the white middle class people feel bad, but so that we can start to unlock the power that we have as we realize the relationships that we have to power. And that's just a little bit more of the megaphone that we had there. And, you know, especially right now with the coronavirus as well, there's this, you know, this idea of the hyper real estate. I just made that up. But basically the digital divide is so huge. in terms of how we get our messages up. So that's a really interesting thing about creative allyship. How can digital media makers, how can we work together in synergy to try and tip the balance, and not so just more that there's more diversity, but the voices and the strategies that are there are from us. So that's just something I've been working on, Climate Reframe, to try and increase the representation of voices, and to not necessarily erase white supremacy, but to recenter. And recentering is a strategy that I use, where it's about how do we constantly make sure we bring our voices back in. And I'm a sibling of an autistic young man, so this is not, again, a tag on Greta. It's about making sure that for the next generation, we're not having to fight whiteness again. So how do we bring our voices back together? And then just lastly, I'm constantly looking for creative ways to address that white supremacy and do it in a spirit of honoring our ancestors. So this was a collaboration with Yara and Davina at Somerset House, where we put up the names of activists and the date of their arrival on Earth and the day that they left. So, I put up some of the names of some of the Indigenous leaders that I work with across Australia. And that's also to sort of challenge this idea that you're the angry brown woman as well, that we can do this in a spirit of understanding our environmental justice history, so that we can understand the legacies that we have, the strategies that we have to create futures. And so, yeah, I keep saying just finishing, but yeah, just this point around, in May, we had a massive Cyclone Amphan displaced over 10 million people. It impacted northern India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and it didn't even make a zip, not only in the media, but in the climate justice world. And so I ended up gathering all of the art that was being produced by young artists in Bangladesh. And I was trying to get them out on my social media, trying to get them trending. And it was just, we have this broken telephone, and I think it's really about the climate literacy as well. Climate change isn't just something in the future. It's not some apocalyptic thing. We're living through it right now. So that's where I really also call on this relationship between artists and activists. How in those crises moments can we, people are already traumatized by coronavirus, but how do we work with art to activate empathy, to get the resources to the spaces that we need them, so we can have an empathetic and responsive climate communications future. So that was the actual end.
Wow, that was great. Thank you. I'm going to ask you just, I've got two questions, and then we'll open up for a Q&A, just so people have a bit of time to gather their thoughts. So the first one is just if you give us a bit more outline on, you called it the non-profit industrial complex, and you were pretty clear in your talk that there's a lot of direct and maybe certainly structural racism and maybe direct racism in the activist sector or in the non-profit sector. But I was wondering if you kind of, it kept on coming up in different ways. But I was wondering if you could maybe speak to what you mean by non-profit industrial sector, because I think if you're not involved with it, it just looks like there's a bunch of people over there kind of working in a kumbaya sort of way, like everyone's happily getting along against like a bad other who's the corporation. But what was interesting in your discussion was actually, we know the corporations are doing the bad work, and sort of that's what needs to be stopped and redressed. But there's also a sense in which when you speak to, or when colleagues of yours speak to the director of Shell, the CEO of Shell, there's a kind of communication that can happen there, which in some ways is a bit more honest than discussions happening within the kind of environmental climate movement, because it's somehow it's a question of like representation outside of the movement. And you're kind of exposing something really interesting about, I don't know what to call it, segmentations or conflicts or sort of structural racisms within it. So I was going to ask you to speak about that, but how you felt like the creative strategies you've outlined let you circumvent some of that kind of power structure.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the nonprofit industrial complex is made up of the funders, the philanthropists, the big NGOs, so, all of them, Greenpeace, Survival International, all the way down to the smaller ones. And basically the top philanthropists, they decide on the strategies, then they set the funding goals, then all of the NGOs apply for funding to those foundations, and that's how the priorities are decided, how the whole thing structures. In the UK specifically, there's a small, there's an Oxford MA where most of the people who work in the environmental sector go to, and it's very cliquey. And so it's like any sector, and that's what I've been trying to reveal a lot, is this is an industry, and also the way that the strategies are set. So for instance, when I talk about responding to an oil spill or responding to a community, a lot of the times I would have to do that work by like just charging it on my credit card or taking another job and paying for that, because the relationship between the front line and what's happening isn't necessarily reflected in those larger structures. And there's actually, now it's come out that the environmental sector is one of the least diverse sectors globally. Even though I'm, like I said, a CEO, I'm quite expert in this field, I can't get a job in this field because I've dared to challenge the racism. I've dared to speak up about the sexual abuse that often happens in these spaces that is unchecked. And so that's why, like, I often joke sometimes, I kind of find it easier to talk to Shell, because I'm like, you're an oil oligarchy, you're messed up, let's have a chat and some cake. But when you're confronting the environmental movement, there is this sense that you are, you're cancelling people, you're being divisive. And so that's why I actually went back and did an arts master's, because I was like, I need to talk about the culture of activism. We need to see that it's a culture if we're going to challenge it, if we're going to move it. Also for my own mental health, Greenpeace actually stole one of my campaigns. Literally, it would have been an intellectual property legal suit, and I challenged them out of court. So that is the level in which it's a very vampiric, extractive culture. So when I'm talking about creating labor for the future, I'm literally saying we need to create new ways of doing this work, new partnerships, because the ones that exist, they're not accountable, they don't protect survivors, they're not moving the money, and they're not actually climate literate. Like the fact that so much resources isn't going towards the COP right now, when we know the COP's not even happening, but there's literally no funding to support frontline resistance.
Yeah, there's a lot to take up there. I was quite interested in, so it sounds like you're saying that the environmental activist sector is extremely hierarchical, and it's kind of hierarchical in the usual ways you could expect from any corporation or business or public service in a way, and that hierarchy is racially organized.
And class, yeah.
But also, in a way, it doesn't get revealed publicly because the sort of the messaging around it puts them on the side of the good guys. Whereas Shell are obviously like super bad people, but in a way, they're also more socially responsible, or try to be more accountable to their public image, because they're more under threat from the consequences of it than, say, Greenpeace might be. So,
Yeah.
I was interested in the way that you're kind of looking for, well, it's not that you're looking to, but I guess my second question was, I was quite interested in this. You mentioned briefly in passing that it took 10 years to get RBS to sort of like, they recognized maybe quite early that there was brand damage, but the campaign took 10 years. And I was comparing that to the usual timeline of people working in the art, which is really not 10 years. It's like, I need when's the show? It's going to be in like 3 months, and like, let's do that. And so the kind of short-termism of the contemporary art sector, in terms of just how fast things are processed, and how fast people pay attention and stop paying attention to things, compared to the kind of long-term 10-year commitment, which is a kind of collective commitment as well. It's not just like an individual looking after their own career. It's like you remain attached to having trying to undermine or ruin RBS's reputation. It's a long attritional campaign. So there was that difference, and I was thinking like, oh, I wonder how artists or people in the creative sector can sort of feed into that. But then you sort of answered it in a way by speaking to the need to refresh, keep yourselves going, kind of just stop being boring in terms of like turning up with the same placard every week, because that does get boring and tiring and demoralizing. So it seemed like there was something there that people in the arts could do to motivate and continue people being motivated outside of this hierarchical structure. So that was the first part of my second question. But I was also kind of compelled a bit by, it sort of felt like there were several things going on simultaneously, and it kind of took me a bit by surprise that what seemed really important in your discussion was this kind of network activity of going between like the corporations, talking to Indigenous people, working on, you have to work really hard on social media to make sure the campaign is up to date. The imagery's got to be grabbing in a kind of Insta, TikTok, if people still use Facebook, that kind of way as well. So there's lots of different actors who have very different needs. And there's also the bureaucracies of the European Union, there's the courts, there's the journalism, there's Grazia. There's kind of different communicational registers, and you're kind of operating all of them simultaneously and acting as a kind of communication channel between them. And that again seemed to me something that actually people in contemporary art are quite good at, is knowing how to play discourses, like received discourses, and sort of twist them around, turn them over, and so on. But there seemed to be something quite, one, really demanding, but also quite unique about that sort of multi-actor network that you're involved in. And the 10-yearness of it, like the scale at which you're working, it's really large, but you also seem to be working as an individual. Or like not, obviously you're not an individual, but you don't have the kind of large corporate hierarchy of like Greenpeace or something, which would be the normal sort of size that you'd imagine dealing with all these different factors. So I'm wondering kind of, I guess, how as small scale organizations or small scale, it's a small number of factors working together, deal with this kind of multiple demand, and whether again you find it useful to look to arts and design as a way to kind of help that along.
Yeah, so there's a more concrete answer, and then there's a more spiritual answer for that too. So I think in a concrete level, and it comes back to the Kardashians, the fact that often within the environmental sector, there is this kind of, it's just a cultural thing that people are disconnected from pop culture. But if we're moving between like pop culture and fashion and all of those spaces, and we're shape-shifting, and we're in relationship with Indigenous communities, I think that's part of decolonizing, because people often think, oh, well, Indigenous people are like in the past, and it's like actually the Indigenous resistance struggles, and the farmers mobilization happening in Canada right now, people are using digital technologies. So decolonizing yourself in terms of the hierarchies of cultures, like we're in a space where all of the cultures need to move between each other. And also I've had to, a lot of that creativity has come from being a survivor in this space of not having that. So, having to learn video editing, the necessity of collaboration, and seeing collaboration as a way of challenging myself as well, to be taken out of my ordinary, taken out of my space. And I think with the tar sands, because the tar sands is so huge, that when you look at it, it touches every sector of society, that I quickly got like a PhD in organizing, where it was like, I am going to have to work on every level. I'm going to have to engage with labor unions. I'm going to have to work in the EU. And that's how Indigenous communities and frontline communities are working, because they're working from a place of survival. And it's also 500 years of strategies. So it's been 500 years of negotiating with that. So the more that you put yourself into the lineage of movements that have been coming, you start to realize all of those strategies that are there, and then you become an alchemist. And I think the big thing is to bring your ego out of it and to be in service. And the more that you're in service, the more that you're bringing those skills to those spaces. And I think also then this is where it gets a bit spiritual, is that I collaborate with unseen forces. Like I collaborate with spirits. I collaborate with, you know, the way I was trained in direct action was we pray before we had the banners. I've never been arrested and I've done crazy stuff. But that's because there was a spiritual foundation. You know, I used to dream up these insurance strategies. So we were working with dream. And that's a part of also decolonizing where we think knowledge comes from, that the economic intuition, the political intuition was all connected with spirituality and relationship with elders. So when we're talking about being intersectional and interdisciplinary, that also means bringing these modalities back into place. And that also then comes into time traveling. You know, if I'm connecting with ancestors that are telling me about the land and we're working in that way and we're thinking about the future, that long-term vision sustains you through these trends. And then the last part on that would be about, you know, the funders are going to come in and out of fashion. Like with the tar sands, we were in for like 2 or 3 years. But when you've witnessed that territory, when you've made relationships with those people, they're like your cousins then. It's not like you can walk away from that. So that, and we can still make those relationships across digital media at this time. So the more you deepen those relationships, yeah, and also I would say have a side hustle. Don't make this your main hustle, because yeah, it's not going to pay off. And that's how we've had to, yeah, and also connect to your own ancestry as well with this work.
What do you mean by that?
So, you know, we all have our own ancestry in terms of the lands that we're connected to. It doesn't necessarily mean the land that we're on. Like for me, instance, I've been researching about the indigenous people from the territory that I'm in India, and they literally, there were women who laid down their lives to protect the trees. And I was like, oh, that's why I'm like this. Like trying to understand. So it doesn't always have to be that it's some indigenous culture that's far away from you as well. Like understand how that's connected to your lineage, or even if it's just a generation ago as well.
Okay. Great. I have more questions, but I'm going to open it up to others.
Yeah, okay. Well, if it isn't too selfish, I thought I had a very simplistic question to ask. And you've probably answered most of it already by the examples you've given. But I was just thinking about us as artists and curators in the contemporary art world, or entering the contemporary art world, and thinking about ways in which the contemporary art world has approached issues of climate breakdown or ecocide so far. Often it's been about communicating information or raising awareness. Like, well, let's think of Olaf Eliasson's big glacier melting in front of the Tate is like an obvious famous example of it. And I was wondering if you think there's room for this idea of raising awareness, or if you think that raising awareness is really beside the point, and that we need to think much more structurally, like where the pressure points are in organizations which actually make a difference, and you know, like understanding structures and how to play your part within. So yeah, like I said, it's a simple question, but do you think raising awareness means anything? Do you think it does anything?
That's a great question. I think we've reached a point where everybody knows. And I think that's part of breaking down this hierarchy of knowledge, or this snobbery that can be in the environmental movement. It's like, if you're a person who has access to a phone, you know about it now. So I think we do need to move beyond awareness raising. And also the worst part about the XR movement has been using fear and using apocalyptic visions to drive people forward. And if you already live on a site of ecocide, you're often not motivated by fear. You're motivated by love of your family, of survival. And you're also, so thinking about shifting now into a mode of information sharing. And so the example I brought up at the end around the cyclone, what we needed with that cyclone was to get the telephone out. We needed people to be like, yo, this has happened, this many people impacted, wake up, this is where you get the information. So going more into a network mind, a responsive mind, and information sharing rather than just blanket fear mongering. Because like I said, and also, especially when you're thinking about BIPOC communities, we're also dealing with police brutality. We're dealing with high rates of COVID-19. So that isn't necessarily the best motivation to engage new communities. So what I would call for is, again, spending this time to understand what is already happening on the ground, what already needs amplifying. I do the socials for a group called Indigenous Climate Action. And often what we need is like illustrators to be like, okay, can you illustrate that, make it look beautiful so we can get it out. We need concrete skills, and we need that kind of ways to break it down as well. The other thing would be to commission Indigenous, Black and Brown communities ourselves to make those works. Like I've never been commissioned to make a work. And to be commissioned to do research so that we can turn our praxis into artworks, so we can tell the stories ourselves and that those works can build capacity within the community themselves. Then the last thing would be also collaboration. That's one of the best ways to enter into a relationship where you can be changed by an artist, you can move resources to those communities, and you can also be changed in that collaboration and learn through that process as well.
Thanks very much. Let's go to the first question on the chat. So Emma, are you around?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what you said about Kim Kardashian and how we should decolonize, because I feel like
Emma, before you ask about decolonizing Kim Kardashian, can you put the video on? Thank you.
I was just wondering how we can decolonize without it being called cultural appropriation, because I feel like those two kind of overlap all the time.
Could you explain a little bit what that overlap is?
Well, no, I was just like wondering, because I feel like, especially as a white person myself, if I try to decolonize, people will call it cultural appropriation.
Okay. I think in the context of climate change, and also I think in the context of Britain, the idea of decolonization has got completely confused. And if we're talking about decolonization, and there's an amazing essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, really recommend that. If we're talking about it in the context of climate change, if it's not connected to the land, if it's not connected to land rights, to sovereignty rights, it's not actually about decolonization, it's something else. It's about diversifying, it's about that. And I think that's something that the British Asian community is also starting to take accountability for. Like me wearing a bindi in Vogue would be super cool, but that would be not decolonizing. That would be diversifying as well. So I think if you as a white person are interested in decolonizing, then that's about you coming into relationship with those land struggles, understanding accountability. I think the question about cultural appropriation and diversity is a separate conversation. And I think we need to reclaim decolonization as connected to the land when it comes to climate justice.
Presumably this is also where your emphasis on listening at the beginning is really important, and being in service of. Yeah,
and it kind of takes the pressure off. Like there's so many podcasts out there, there's so many talks on YouTube by Indigenous communities, and then it's not about, I think this is also about when we talk about creativity, and often creativity in climate change and climate action doesn't mean that you have to invent a new app or you've got to make a new work. Sometimes that creativity is about like, okay, well, I know how to get that resource for that person or move that infrastructure or bring my skills or bring your talents. So there's kind of a humbling as well, and that doesn't mean that you can't see yourself in it, but and I think that's sometimes how we rethink about decolonizing architecture as well. It's not always making another building. It could be putting a milk crate for a cat so it has a shelter. I don't know, something simple. That's just because I just did that. But well, thank you for sharing the essay. Yeah, that's great. It's in the chat.
Okay. Neve, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Sorry. Hi. Thank you for the talk. It's been really great so far. I guess I'm curious because I'm curious about you're talking with Shell or talking with financial centers that are, I guess, causing the most climate detriment and breakdown because they're investing in fossil fuel industry and in mining and extraction industries. It's kind of, how do you open up that communication channel with them? How do you, in that case, if that channel is open, kind of convey a sense of a non-financial relationship to nature via working with Indigenous communities and those who are in the front lines of this to show this is what the land means to them. And then if that's communicated, like, I guess, how do you know if it's, not if it's worked, but if they've actually listened? Because I was working a bit with a bank in the summer and around kind of climate breakdown, and trying to understand if they'd actually listened to me was one of the hardest things. So I guess I'm curious how you navigate that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so there are organizations that are working on this that have like Share Action. They're a great one. I would say they're the best one to go to because they can literally get you the shares, and they've been doing these campaigns with a long-standing relationship. In terms of getting these people to understand their relationship, I think I've got to the point where actually I don't expect them to wake up. I don't expect my oppressor or these oppressors to decolonize. When I go into those shareholder meetings, I would have a suit and I would talk about these situations from, I'd pretend I was a shareholder and talk about risk. You have to translate it into their language because that's all they care about. So for instance, right now, we're trying to communicate to insurers how Indigenous resistance to pipelines increases the project stoppage, which is a risk to their project. Therefore, they have to respect Indigenous rights. So I'm translating it into that. I don't expect that corporation or that bank to decolonize because if you think about it, Lloyd's was founded on slavery. Lloyd's is a colonial institution. So I think that's why we have to be really careful with these strategies and really critical of them and not put all our eggs in those baskets. Also, we got Shell to get out of the tar sands, and then another company came in and just bought it up. So while we're doing this campaigning, we also have to be thinking about shifting the legal strategies. And that's why the actual land rights, the sovereignty rights, that futuristic idea of taking the land back has to be the key of that. So I would say if you're engaging in that, also find out, again, going back to the megaphone, which Indigenous communities already are challenging a corporation for a certain thing. How can you be in allyship and support that, especially if you're in the UK? Sometimes they need, people to be there and to put action on there. But then also not expecting that they're gonna wake up. So and I always see it like theatre. Like when I go to the Shell, I'm in my suit. It's a theatre where you're translating it, and sometimes it's quite fun to just make the economic argument because we're in a point now where the economic arguments alone are strong enough. The Bank of England acknowledges that tar sands and coal are not a good investment. So you can be quite powerful just using the financial arguments alone as well. When you're communicating the other parts, that's about communicating it to the financial press, the other actors, the shareholders, trying to, if you can, awaken the shareholders to make that moral shift.
Thank you.
Well, we'd love somebody else to write a question in the chat. Suhail, do you have any filler questions?
Thanks. They might actually have some credit in the room. I got loads I want to talk about, but I'm also conscious that that it will go on for quite some time. But maybe I'll just ask a final one, because I'm aware, like, you know, with your family situation, Suzanne, I don't want to like preoccupy you and exhaust you too much. So I think partly just coming out of Neve's question, it seemed to me that, you know, the art field is not one thing. People have like, there's lots of different, some people are really good at image making, some people want to work on the contract form, other people want to work institution and so on. So it seems to me like there's something about the multiplicity or multifariousness of types of practice that are available within contemporary art specifically, that can sort of help in different aspects. So, you know, I think it's just to go back to the all-oneness of the campaigns that you're running, and the need to kind of like have a media impact, as well as talk to the shareholders with a business suit and do that kind of performance theatre thing, as well as kind of talk or listen rather to people in Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
All of which kind of correspond to different types of practice. So I think it might be, you know, if people are kind of thinking about this going like, oh, as an artist, I don't do all of that stuff. You may not need to, but there are, you know, if you have an interest in manipulating contract forms, for example, or working in kind of commercial press, then that's a point of specific intervention. And I guess the other thing I thought, because again, I'm thinking about this mainly from like, oh, how can art help you? Oh, you seem to have a really good handle on it already. The other thing I was struck by in the discussion was when you said how actually sometimes Indigenous people that you're working with don't correspond to the stereotype of the cliche. So they're not in loincloths and they don't look impoverished enough. They might be driving 4x4s around Alberta or something like this, using cell phones and sort of WhatsApping and on Twitter and the rest of it. And that's not what an Indigenous person corresponds to in the cliche of it. And I think one of the things that we work on quite hard is actually to kind of disrupt or change the typical representation and introduce new modalities of representation and identification and transformation as well. So maybe one of the ways in which in the art space, one of the, I guess, communication vectors that we could, you know, that art would be good for would be to change the expectation of what, you know, what is the corporate person? What is the Indigenous person? What does land look like if it's supposed to be despoiled and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this. It's going to sound quite slushy or emotional, but I actually thought about the fact that art actually saved my life in this work, because I was feeling so confined to this this model that I had to put my body on the line. I had to engage in certain security situations. I had to allow for sexual abuse. I had to be considered not a CEO because I'm like 5'2", whatever. All of those constraints within that culture pushed me to art. And it was in art that, one is the philosophy of even you know, that black cloth I had with the circles, you know, I just created that from an old action, and I cut a circle and I was like, right, in this space, it's a safe space. We can talk about class and race and philosophize. And I literally had to create that space within art to reflect on the culture, to reflect on time and space and geography. So, and I think that's where I got really inspired by Boyce. I studied with Shelley Sachs, and the role of art to have that space to think about what is a human being, what is the relationship to nature, what is my place in that. And because of the climate crisis, there's a culture sometimes of making within activism that is like urgency, you've got to do, and this funding structure. So there isn't that space to respond to your ancestors, respond to the communities. So that's where I think art is this philosophical grounding. It's a space to break out of those paradigms. And also within myself, I was like, you know, I'm currently reading through all of Tesla's readings. I'm fascinated by the writings that he had. I'm making
Nicholas Tesla.
Yeah, I'm reading his writings at the moment because I'm in Croatia, and I'm making a film about the sea. Like I couldn't have all those parts of myself within that culture. So I think we have to think about this as a renaissance. And so the role of the art is to bring art and science and philosophy, to bring those things back into us And I think you can have those two streams. You can sort of give yourself a break and be responsive, find out what's already happening, bring your skills there, bring the galleries and the skills that you have there, and then also open up this space of, you know, we've never faced a climate crisis and a pandemic with fascism before. So it's going to take innovation and creativity. So really, you know, journal, dream, open up all those spaces that I think we all have these innovations in us. And there might be unexpected ones. Like I never thought I would be working in insurance, you know, so really open up that space. And then the other thing would be just, and I mentioned it before, is collaboration. Really think about, like, research some of the young Indigenous artists, the younger voices. Think about how you can, even if it's hosting a Zoom conversation at your gallery, doing takeovers on your Instagram, really, you know, there's so much privilege within the art world, and you can miss it and not understand even having how an Instagram account where you can amplify people is a resource as well. So really understand that exchange of resources is great. And if you are a grant writer, you know, supporting folks who might not necessarily be in that world, but you can see them making ecological works to get those resources as well.
Amazing. Okay. We've got a question from somebody called User, which is not that helpful. But I thought we'd maybe listen to User's question, and then we'd listen to Sophie's question, and then Maria's question, and then you could answer them all together. So if User is here, please step forward.
User might be their name, James. It might be a little bit.
I've looked at the MFA register, so.
Yeah.
Oh, I think they're on the video. I can see them.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to unmute yourself? Cool.
Hey, Suzanne, thank you for your talk. That was really great. So I have a question. My name is Giuseppe, by the way. I have a question about this theater that you were talking about this like theatrics that I guess like we as like Black and brown people have to like constantly perform, like, which is also like a type of diplomacy that we practice when we enter these like spaces, or like academia, or like white spaces, I guess you could say, whiteness. We engage with whiteness. And I don't know, it's a simple question, but just when does this performance end for you? And especially since in these activist cultures, we begin to cultivate friendships and yeah, these relationships like inhabit these like activist spaces. Like when do we, or for you, when do you establish this boundary?
Oh, she'd asked me this about 10 years ago. I think, you know, there's a few ways that I think I use that performativeness. Like when I'm at a shareholder meeting and I straighten my hair and I'm in a suit and playing with those spaces, and then playing being a philosopher. And I think for a long time, I also, you know, I played down my glam, or I played down those parts of myself. And then it was when I started centering the relationships with the frontline communities more, and I started speaking up. And I think it was when I hit a suicidal depression, actually, around being a survivor of abuse within the movement, where I realized that actually this movement didn't necessarily see me in the future, but I was going to the future. And that was when I started shifting who I worked with. And also I felt a responsibility to speak up for especially other queer women of color, that, you know, and it was kind of a bit of a like, well, if I'm going to the future, I have to make sure that the ground is stable and who is coming with me. And I had coronavirus in March, and I think that shifted me too now. So now it's been really interesting that the people that have been there for me when I've spoken up about white supremacy, when I've spoken up about these things, have been unlikely allies. They've actually been like Hollywood producers and actors and people who I never imagined. And all these other spheres of activism have opened up for me. So that would be one thing I would say, is that we're in a new paradigm. And those cliquey small activism circles that used to control things, they don't really anymore, because so many people have awakened and there's so many different spaces that we need to do this work. Yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah. And so what is, sorry, I just
Go ahead.
a follow-up thing. So what does this awakening imply for you? For these from these people that may be unprecedented?
At this time?
Yeah.
I think some of it is just we reached the tipping point. Like we did reach the tipping point with the climate catastrophes. We did reach a communications tipping point. Like I remember when we were doing this stuff like back in 2009, and we'd be like sitting in a flat with like rats eating our bags, and we were like, whoa, we're actually creating the future right now, and this will be the movement. So this time was prophesized by the Indigenous elders, by our elders, that we would be in this time when there would be this awakening. And I think some of it is because it's got so bad. Also, so many people have stepped forward. And then I think the corona crisis kind of shifted us into a space of recognizing our mortality. But also these movements have been designed, like there has been this design to bring awareness to the ecocide, to these tipping points for a long time. So yeah, so I think the awakening, I mean, is that it's a decolonizing too, and thinking that, you know, in India right now, it's 12 million farmers and labor movements on the street challenging Modi. So we're in this space where the movements are so interconnected to the anti-fascist movements, the labor movements, the land movements, that they're not these kind of elite Oxbridge climate movements. So that means that there's so many other actors and so many other things at stake, you know, like the anti-fascism movements, we're all invested in that. So the more we can see the relationship between the land movements and those anti-fascist movements and bring them together, because they're not separate for us, right, from our communities. I think that's what awakens it. But then you also have to break that down yourself, and it takes a risk to be like, I'm actually going to not stand for that abuse in those spaces. And personally, I've taken a hit for that. I've lost a lot of friends, had to move countries a few times. But when you're grounded in the communities and in that spirituality, I think he gets you through that too.
Thank you.
Great. Maria, your question was kind of related to Giuseppe's question. Do you want to add anything to it? That's Maria, your anchor.
Hi. I don't know. That was a lot to take in right away. But I guess to like kind of link off of what Giuseppe was asking, like in drawing your emotional, spiritual, mental boundaries, like what are the support systems that you found to be the most grounding, and ways that you like are able to keep some sort of separation or strength for yourself in this? Because your talk was like, with everything that's happened like in this past year, and like as someone who has also worked in like a big nonprofit organization like that and done grassroots organizing, this is like a very emotionally charged topic, and it's very difficult to speak about when you haven't dealt with a lot of the trauma that you're asked to deal with on almost a daily basis. Like, how are you moving forward with it on like a daily spectrum?
It keeps coming back to Kim Kardashian, but I'm joking, but I'm not joking. I have a really separate life from all this stuff. So I don't judge myself that I like to watch trash, and I like nice clothes, and I like nice things. And it sounds really trivial, but remembering to enjoy life, to love life is really part of it. And that connects to a big part of my practice is around biophilia and bionosis. So biophilia is the love of nature, and bionosis is the knowledge that comes from loving nature. So when things were the worst for me, I actually went to Croatia and swam. I'm actually in Croatia now. And I swam for weeks, and I communed with the sea, and I spoke to the sea and wrote about the sea and just followed that love. And it was also to remember what you're fighting for. And if you don't know what you're fighting for, so having that separate life, remembering what nourishes you and not letting that get to you. I think I also I mean, and this is a privilege to do this, I had to let go of this idea of going up a career ladder, that I was going to go up this career ladder, and I had to stay very humble in the work and be open to that in a way, because if you're challenging the nonprofit industrial complex, having other skills and maybe other things that you work in that pay the bills that aren't necessarily so charged that you have safety as well. So yeah, so make sure you have other people that you speak to and talk to, like, that aren't necessarily in that world, that connect you to it. And so when I talk about the biophilia and the bionosis, that's because I think there's a physical rejuvenation, and there's also a humility. Like, I sometimes go to the water and I'm like, yo, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to be this. And that's part of the training I received as well, was I see the water as a collaborator. And that's part of, I'm also decolonizing. So I can't come up with the solutions to this, because I'm also from that mind that creating them. So that's how I decolonize, is through swimming, through that body practice, and being open to that awareness.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful advice. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. And I just wanted to say, yeah, on a wrap up, you know, that there's just so many great podcasts and resources to listen to, and I can share some of them afterwards. But yeah, just the last thing will be, in terms of whiteness and decentering whiteness, I feel like the biggest thing as well is also to know when that you don't want to talk about that as well, and when to also the repair and the relationships between Black and Brown communities and Indigenous communities as well, and finding space for that as well. So part of, I think, responding to whiteness is also then having the spaces where we get to be philosophers and thinkers and creative, and you get to not always be responding to that as well. So it's just and so I want to thanks actually for the last part of this. I felt like we got a chance to do that we also create spaces where we don't have to just be the anti-oppression trainers, the anti-white supremacist trainers. We get to be fully in ourselves as well.
That's great. Thank you.